Dana Sparks, broker of Maximum One Greater Atlanta Realtors, and this week's contract tip has to do with the backup contingency exhibit. Specifically, I'm going to focus on the GAR, the Georgia Association of Realtors GAR exhibit, and then in the next video, I will focus on the backup contingency exhibit from the RE forms. But in the backup contingency exhibit, this is an exhibit is definitely important to go over in the market that we are experiencing right now, where there is less inventory than there are buyers in many price ranges in many areas, creating a multiple offer situation. And so if you watch the last video, what I encourage both buyers and sellers to do is to for sellers to accept a primary contract, and then to accept and negotiate and accept another contract is a backup contract. Now, you buyers, if you miss out on the first house or being primary contract on a property that you really like, I strongly suggest that you negotiate that contract with that seller and get in the backup position and be a true binding backup. Now, you will hear a lot of listing agents that mistakenly will tell a buyer's agent, yeah, we have several backup offers. That is totally not true. You can only have one, you can have a lot of offers, but you don't have any backup offers. You don't have several backup offers. You can only have one binding backup offer. And the reason is because it does go binding with party signatures, and in the backup contingency exhibit, it references the primary contract. Therefore, you can only have one binding contract. So if you have a listing agent that says they have several backups, they don't at all. And I still strongly encourage you to negotiate a contract to get in the binding backup position. So let's go over, it's great for both parties. It is wonderful for a listing agent because for a seller, because if the primary contract falls through, you don't have to go back on the open market. You automatically go to the binding backup contract that you have. It's great for a buyer because a buyer can be in backup position to a property that they want, that they're not primary, in case the primary contract does fall through. So let's go over this. This is the GAR form F91 backup agreement contingency exhibit. And again, it really is a fabulous way to go under contract in this market for both. It's a great thing for both a buyer and a seller. So a buyer will present an offer and a seller will counter or accept it or whatever, but you negotiate, the buyer and the seller negotiate. For all the terms, and you come to an agreement on all the rest of the terms of the purchase and sale agreement. The only difference is you include this backup contingency exhibit as part of the binding contract. And so what it says is this exhibit is part of the agreement with the offer date, and just like any exhibit, you reference the offer date with the property address. And then it says, buyer and seller acknowledge that this is a backup or a secondary agreement to the primary agreement, which may be amended from time to time. And then it references, you fill in the blank of the primary agreement. You put in the date of the primary agreement, and you reference the actual buyer's name on the primary agreement. So again, that's why there can really only be one backup, because you have to reference the primary contract. Then it says, upon closing the sale of the primary agreement. So if the contract that the seller has with the first contract, if that goes through and it closes, then this backup contract terminates. And it says, upon closing of the sale of the primary agreement, this agreement shall terminate, and the buyer is entitled to all of their earnest money back. Then it also says that, the buyer of contract number 2, the backup contract, understands that the seller may negotiate and may amend the contract with the primary buyer, and it doesn't change the status of this one being secondary. Then it also further says that buyer acknowledges that buyer shall have no right to examine or be advised of the terms of the primary contract. So the seller does not have to disclose any of the terms or anything going on with the primary contract. The buyer of the backup contract just needs to know, number 1, if the primary contract closes, or number 2, if it terminates. And that's the next section, which is paragraph 5. In the event the primary agreement is terminated, then the seller shall deliver notice to the buyer, that primary contract terminated. And please review all the other videos on the specific forms of notice. This is not agent email to agent email, but this has to be formal notice from the seller with the seller's signature to the buyer. So after the seller informs this backup buyer that the primary contract terminated with the formal notice form, and again, I'll put a link below to that to that video that I've done on that. Then this contract, this backup contract, is no longer subject to this backup contingency. It, in effect, becomes the primary contract. And buyer and seller shall close on this agreement in accordance with the terms and conditions provided. So everything that was already negotiated is now into play because this is now the primary contract. So it all closes, notwithstanding anything contrary contained herein. All parties agree that for the purposes of this contract, now the binding agreement date becomes the date that the backup contract received the written notice that they became primary. So you guys all know that the binding agreement date is the date from which all the other contingencies are timed. So we were already in backup position. So you actually signed and you wrote a binding agreement date when you went binding with this backup contingency exhibit. But for all the time frames in the rest of the contract, for example, all the contingencies, the due diligence contingency, the appraisal contingency, the financing contingency, for those time frames, those start, day 0 is when this backup buyer receives that written notice signed by the seller that they are now primary. Binding agreement date shall be the date that they receive notice of the termination of the primary contract is delivered from the seller to the buyer. Now, what do we do about the closing date? Because in this contract, you had to have negotiated a closing date. Well, what if we don't get word that we become the primary contract until really too close for the closing date? Well, the exhibit accounts for that. And it says in paragraph 5B, the closing date shall be the date listed on the agreement. So whatever date that the buyer and the seller initially had negotiated, unless because of the time frame within which this backup contingency exhibit got notified that the primary had actually terminated, because of the change of the binding agreement date, any of the time periods for a buyer to conduct due diligence or fulfill any of their other contingencies in the agreement, it ends up extending it beyond what was the original closing date. Then the new closing date is 7 days from the last date the buyer has to fulfill those contingencies, or the end of due diligence, whichever is later. Okay, so what that means is when this backup buyer is first negotiating with the seller, and you put a closing date, and then let's say this backup buyer still stays in it, and you get notified from the seller that the primary contract terminated. But let's say we are 8 days outside of what we had negotiated as a closing date. Well, because we have a new binding agreement date, the date that we received notice from the seller that we're now primary, that's the new binding agreement date. If we had, let's say 10 days due diligence and 21 days for financing contingency, obviously the closing date is the time frames are all out of whack because of the time frame that we got date of notice. So what happens is that the new closing date changes until, let me read that again. The closing date shall be the date listed in the agreement unless, because of the change in the binding agreement date, any of the time periods for the buyer to conduct their due diligence or to fulfill any other contingencies in the agreement extend beyond the closing date, in which event the new closing date shall be 7 days from the last date of the buyer has to fulfill whatever the contingencies or the end of any due diligence, whichever is later. So everything shifts according to those terms. And then paragraph 6 is a buyer out. So the buyer, if this agreement doesn't become primary by such and such a date. So the buyer and the seller in this backup exhibit negotiate a date under which this becomes primary. And if it doesn't become primary, because right now the backup buyer is waiting to hear word from the seller. Well, what this last paragraph says is if the buyer doesn't hear from the seller by a certain date, then this agreement automatically terminates. Additionally, the buyer may terminate this agreement at any time before getting notice that they are now primary. And they just give notice to the seller. And again, that notice form is not an agent-to-agent email, but it must be done on the proper form with the signature of the buyer. And the so the agreement, the buyer can terminate. If it automatically terminates if it doesn't become primary by a certain date, or the buyer may terminate this backup agreement at any time before being notified that they're primary by sending written notice to the seller and by paying the seller a termination fee of $10. So again, all the time frames and everything is spelled out in the actual contingency. Again, it is in the GAR form, GAR form. It is F91 Backup Agreement Contingency Exhibit. A great form for buyers and sellers in a really fast market. So thank you so much for watching. I hope this contract tip helped you out. Dana Sparks, broker of Maximum One Greater Atlanta Realtors, satisfying your needs with service, innovation, and education. Can I see my silly pot? Nami.